Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a beginner's guide to Path of Exile. Now for a lot of new players, be they coming from Diablo 3 or completely new to the action RPG genre, Path of Exile can be a difficult and at times overwhelming game. So hopefully this video can help make that journey, or dare I say path, a little less daunting. Alright, let's quickly begin with one aspect of character creation, which is picking your league and picking either hardcore, softcore, or solo self-found. So first off, solo self-found is an option that makes it so that you cannot trade or party with other players. And if at any point you change your mind, you can convert it to a normal character, but you can't go back to solo self-found. Next, between standard or challenge league, well, think of season versus non-season in Diablo 3, or ladder versus non-ladder in Diablo 2. A new challenge league is a fresh start, and in Path of Exile, new challenge leagues often introduce new content and new sweeping mechanics. For instance, we had Bestiary League, which allowed you to capture critters, add them to your stable, and unlock crafting recipes, a little bit like Pokemon. And then we had Delve League as well this year, which basically introduced a massive dungeon to explore, to delve. Leagues last about 3 months, and once a league ends, your character gets converted to Standard League. Then your next option is to create a hardcore character or not, and hardcore behaves very differently in Path of Exile than it does in the Diablo series. In Diablo, a hardcore character means that once your character dies, it's dead forever, gone. All your progress is lost. Whereas in Path of Exile, upon death, your hardcore character is converted into a standard softcore character, regardless of whether he was a standard league hardcore or a challenge league hardcore character. So none of your progress is lost, but you can no longer play with the hardcore cool kids. Alright, next on to class selection. There are 7 base classes to select from in Path of Exile. But in this game, your class selection isn't as important as in most other action RPGs. And that's because your skills are not determined by your class, but rather by skill gems. More on those later. So basically you can have 2 builds using similar skill gems, but based off of different base classes. Now, you'll note that I keep repeating base classes, and that's because you'll eventually work your way towards an ascendancy class, which is like a prestige class or a subclass. It's a deeper specialization in the same way that a chemist would be a deeper specialization of a scientist base class. So when describing your character, you'll likely not refer much to your base class, but mostly your ascendancy class, and most base classes have a selection of 3 ascendancies to choose from. For instance, over here with the witch, I've chosen the necromancer. And what you're seeing right here is the passive skill tree. Something that is often very daunting to new players, given there are over 1,000 nodes over here. And ultimately you'll end up allocating less than 10% of these, so your choices really matter. Your base class will determine where on this tree you begin. As a witch, we start over here, but as you can see, there are a total of 7 different starter locations, 1 for each class. Now let's help demystify and simplify this skill tree. You'll note that roughly 1/3 of the nodes are simple things like +10 to intelligence. This is how you increase your base stats. In Diablo 2, when you leveled up, you would gain stat points to allocate to your attributes. In Path of Exile, it's all done through the skill tree. Then you'll have other nodes that give straightforward buffs like 16% increased spell damage, or 6% increased maximum energy shield. And then lastly, you have your keystone nodes. These are these big, important looking ones, and with good reason, because they have significant game-altering effects. For instance, Pain Attunement here makes you deal 30% more spell damage when low on life. And these are the really important nodes that you'll likely want to be planning a path towards on the skill tree. It's best not to just willy-nilly make a decision on the spot, but plan ahead. See where you want to go. You'll notice these as well, with this symbol around them. These are also more important, but not as game-changing as the keystone nodes. And the reason it's so important to think ahead and to plot a path along the skill tree is because respecking in this game is not easy, especially for beginners. As you progress through the story, you'll get a few respec points, but not enough to undo anything significant. Eventually, you can acquire items called Orbs of Regret that allow you to undo some changes, but for a beginner, these will be hard to come by. So So if you're new to this game, you'll likely want to find and follow a build guide to ensure that you don't screw up your first character. And when looking for build guides, you're going to try to look for build guides that are labeled as beginner friendly or league starter guides or even solo self-found friendly. That said, if you're the kind of person that enjoys learning through trial and error, experimenting, screwing up, starting over again, then first off, this is a great game for you. And second, then do whatever you want. And hopefully without any experience, you're able to plot yourself a path that works out for you. Now, once you've unlocked your ascendancy class, you'll get a new little tab here that will open up new skill nodes that you can take that are specific to your ascendancy. These lead you to arguably some of the most significant and important nodes on your tree. Thankfully though, these skill points are separate, called ascendancy points, so you can't stock up on other skill points and then pop them in here, or vice versa. Now, in order to unlock your ascendancy class, you'll first have to complete something called the labyrinth. But to complete the labyrinth, you first need to complete the Trials of Ascendancy. These are a form of dungeons with monsters and lots of traps, and serve as basically practice for the labyrinth itself. Now, in the Act 3 town, the Sarn encampment, if you go up here, you'll find something called the Ascendancy plaque. Clicking on this allows you to track your progress towards unlocking the labyrinth. And once you have unlocked access, you then have access to the Aspirants Plaza. And from there, you're able to enter the labyrinth. Now, once you've completed the labyrinth once, you've unlocked your ascendancy class, but your journey isn't over yet. To get even more ascendancy points, you'll have to complete the labyrinth 3 more times in total. And each time, the labyrinth becomes more and more challenging. Now, the labyrinth itself is labyrinthine. Every day the layout is randomized, and if you want to save time on completing it, you can use a resource at PoElab.com to see the current day's labyrinth map and the shortest path to complete it. Now, we've explained that your class doesn't determine your skills, and that it's skill gems that do instead. And skill gems are items that you can find as drops, that you get as quest rewards, that you can buy from vendors, or you can trade for with other players. And you socket them into gear to use them. Skill gems come in 3 colors: green, blue, and red, and they must be socketed into a socket of the appropriate color. Now, some items have white sockets, and a white socket is a socket that will take any colored gem. For instance, there's a unique item called a tabula rasa. This is a piece of chest armor that has 6 white linked sockets, but no other stats. This is an excellent item for leveling a new character, but likely not something you'll use at higher levels, but you can always trade it to other players for a good price. Now, there's also technically a 4th color of gem, a white gem, which, as you may have guessed, can fit into any color socket. But you won't be dealing with those very much. Now, you'll note that we have linked and unlinked sockets. The links are these golden bars between the sockets. Now, these links are of particular importance to the connection between active and support gems. So for instance, here I have Raise Zombie. This is an active skill gem, and I have 3 support gems that are linked to it to support it. Minion damage support to make my zombies do more damage, maim support to make them do basically more damage, and melee physical damage support to make them deal more damage. So support gems do nothing on their own. They only work if they are linked to an active gem, and they will enhance or modify the active gem in some way. Now, not all support gems can impact any active gem. You have to make sure that it will apply. And to help you figure that out, you'll notice that gems have different categories. For instance, my Raise Zombie is categorized as spell and minion. So you'll notice that minion damage support states that it supports minion skills. This is a minion skill. Maim support says supports attack skills, and melee physical damage says supports melee attack skills. Now, Raise Zombie here is a special case. While it only states spell and minion, in the description you can see that the zombies are granted a melee attack, so that's why they benefit from these additional support gems. Now, as you fight monsters and gain XP, your gems will also gain XP and level up and become more powerful. But as your gems rise in power, so too do the requirements to equip those gems. You see, every gem has a requirement. As you can see here, requires level 68 and 151 intelligence. So you may not always want to level up a gem, because if, for instance, I only have 146 intelligence due to certain items I have equipped that grant me more intelligence, and then I change my gear, I may not be able to use my gem anymore. Or sometimes there are game mechanic reasons on why you wouldn't want to level a gem beyond a certain point. If you're following a build guide, make sure to pay attention for that. As you can see down here, these are 2 skills that I haven't leveled up, partly because I don't need to level them any further, and I also don't want to just artificially inflate their requirements. Now, if you do ever accidentally overlevel a gem, one thing you can do is actually sell the gem to a vendor along with an orb of scouring. This is a special vendor recipe that will de-level the gem by 1 level. But another option would be to buy a piece of gear that fills in the necessary attribute, at least temporarily. In particular, amulets tend to be a very good source of attributes. Now, another thing to mention is that unlike in Diablo 3, where everything scales off of your weapon damage, in Path of Exile, things only scale off of your weapon damage if they are listed as an attack skill. If it is a spell skill like this, like Raise Zombie, or anything else other than an attack skill, it will not have its damage be based on your weapon's damage. So if you are using attack skills, it is very important to get a weapon with high damage. Otherwise, if you are using spells, for instance, then maybe you'll really want a wand that has a big boost to spell damage. Alright, let's talk a bit about potions in Path of Exile, which are called flasks. You can have up to 5 equipped at a time, and every flask has a number of charges on it before it is depleted. And flasks regain their charges either when you kill enemies or when you visit town. Now you have your expected flasks like health flasks and mana flasks, but you also have flasks that give you temporary buffs. Personally, I believe the Quicksilver flask to be indispensable, especially for the early game. 40% more move speed for 4 seconds. In fact, often having even 2 Quicksilver flasks is a great idea. And like any other item, flasks can drop as magic items with special properties, and even as unique items. Alright, let's talk about Path of Exile's currency system, which is a fair bit more complicated than any other action RPG. Path of Exile has no gold as a base currency. Instead, the currency system is based on a rather complex trading system. Each NPC vendor may ask for a different form of currency in exchange for its goods. But as opposed to gold, in Path of Exile, every piece of currency has some use to it, beyond just being an exchange good. For instance, a chromatic orb allows you to randomly reroll the colors of sockets on an item. Or an orb of alteration randomly reforges a magic item with new properties. Now, the most standardized forms of currency at Endgame in Path of Exile between players are Chaos Orbs and Exalted Orbs. But earlier on in the game, Orbs of Alchemy tend to be a decent currency used for bartering amongst players. Now, if you happen to come across some of these more rare forms of currency like a Chaos Orb, it's generally best to save it rather than use it for its properties. Save it and use it to buy yourself something nice. Because while you can play Path of Exile solo self-found or just without any trading, trading is a pretty significant part of the game. And I would point you toward the website pathofexile.com/trade as a tremendous resource for finding and buying items from other players, as well as being able to price items to know how much to sell your item for. Now, trading is a whole system onto itself and is kind of beyond the scope of this video, so let's get now into the endgame content. In Path of Exile, you have 10 acts to play through. Acts 1 through 5 in Part 1, and then 6 through 10 in Part 2, where you revisit areas you visited in Part 1. Once you've completed the story, that's when you get to the endgame, mapping. Now, maps are items that start to drop as you reach the endgame. And just like any other item, they can drop as normal, magic, rare, or even unique. The more affixes you have on a map, the greater the challenge, but the greater the reward. Now, you open a map by inserting it into your map device, and you can at this point apply modifiers to it in order to again increase the challenge. Once you've activated, 6 portals will open up, and every time you go through a portal, it is consumed, it's gone. That means as a solo player, you can go into this map a total of 6 times before you can never get back into it. Or if you're a party of 6, then every member of the party can go through one portal and then no one can ever get back in. So if anyone dies, they can't get back in. If anyone needs to go back to town to sell stuff, they can't go back in. Now in total, there are over 150 maps laid out on an atlas. And there's a total of 16 tiers of maps, with every tier becoming increasingly difficult. And you need to complete lower tier maps in order to get higher tier maps to drop. And the atlas allows you to track your progress in doing so. Of course, you can also just trade with other players for any map you want. And by completing objectives in the atlas, you eventually unlock the ability to fight bosses and other challenges for varying rewards, but that's a bit beyond the scope of today's discussion. Now, in general, before you really get into mapping, you should be at least level 63-ish with at least 75% elemental resistance, but we'll get to elemental resists in a little bit. So we'll finish off with miscellaneous information and advice, and we'll start by saying that areas are instanced, and you can force an instance of a new area by control left clicking. So for instance, if you have run through an area, killed all the monsters, and you want to run the area again, then be it through the waypoint or through the entrance to the area, just hold control and then left click on it, and you'll have the option to enter a new instance. To quickly move an item from your stash into your inventory or vice versa, control left click to easily move it back and forth. This also works for vendors. Hold shift and left click on a stack of items in order to split the stack however you want, and press X to swap between two weapon sets. Now let's talk a bit about those resistances. Unlike in Diablo 3, where you could for the most part focus primarily on offense and largely ignore defense and still do relatively well, in Path of Exile, defense is very important. In particular, if you ignore your 3 elemental resistances, fire, cold, and lightning, then you're gonna have a bad time. Each of these 3 resistances is capped at 75%, so you cannot ignore more than 75% of damage from a particular element. That said, there are skills and weapons that will allow you to change those caps. Now that said, there are still reasons that you want to go above 75% resistance, and that's because as you progress throughout the game, you suffer increasing penalties to your resistances, up to a maximum of negative 60% at the endgame. It thus becomes increasingly important to up your resistances to account for these massive penalties. When you're looking at your resistances in your character sheet, you can see your current resistance and your uncapped resistance in brackets. So if this were to say 75% and 129%, that would mean that I'm capped at 75, but I have enough resistance to go up to 129 or whatever I said. So similarly, if you get afflicted by something that reduces your resistances, then you still have a good amount of buffer thanks to going beyond your cap. If you're wondering how much of a buffer to keep, how far beyond your capped resistance you should go by the endgame, generally 34 above is enough. Now you might freak out at seeing your chaos resistance being pretty terrible, and as a new player I would say don't even worry about that. One thing you likely do want to worry about though is getting lots of life nodes in the passive tree, and you can easily sort and search through your passive tree by typing in life for instance. And then we can see here, life regeneration, 4% increased max life, 3% increased max life, and so on and so on. And we'll also mention as a little tip here that getting move speed on your boots is very important. Time is money. Well, there's no money in Path of Exile, so time is various bits of crafting materials. Basically, the faster you move, the faster you kill, the faster you kill, the faster you get reward and level up, and it's just a good idea. Now, another thing I will highly recommend is installing a loot filter. You go into your options and UI, and over here you'll notice that you can select a loot filter. Now, you'll need to go download those, and I suggest you look up Filterblade, NeverSync. Go to filterblade.xyz for instructions on how to download and install a loot filter, because you get a lot of items to drop in Path of Exile. And as a new player, it's difficult to know what's important and what's not, and these filters, which are highly customizable, will help you learn what is stuff that you don't necessarily have to pick up, because if you pick up everything, you're going to be making a lot of trips back to town. And frankly, even as a new player, there are a lot of things that simply are not worth your time. A loot filter will make it such that some items are much more prominent and others are less prominent, and this roughly weighs their importance. Now, the last thing that I'll mention is that Path of Exile is a free-to-play game with microtransactions, and there are a good many cosmetic microtransactions, but there's also a lot of stash-related microtransactions, and I've spent a good amount of money on the stash ones. So first off, as you'd expect, you can simply buy more stash tabs, but then you can also buy premium stash tabs. These are more customizable and necessary if you're going to get into more complex trading. Then you also have specific stash tabs designed for specific purposes. For instance, this is a map stash tab that classifies and groups all of your maps accordingly. Then you also have a currency stash tab, which will conveniently categorize all of your currency items. Compare that to the old way that I had before I bought it, and you can see how it's a lot more cumbersome to manage your currency before buying a premium tab. That said, you don't have to buy anything, and it is definitely manageable to play this game without spending a dime. And that's going to wrap up this beginner's guide to Path of Exile. There's obviously far more to explore here, but hopefully this will make your journey into the game a little bit smoother. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. If you like what you see on this channel and want to support the creation of more content, you can consider becoming a Royal Raider on Patreon, where your support is immensely appreciated. We've got a variety of backer rewards, including behind-the-scenes content, monthly virtual hangouts, and more. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more gaming content.